So I'm going to talk about the history of the Blue Star Highway site, Blue Star Highway and ferry, and just want to like get a taste of when you drive by there, what do you think, what do you feel? Just shout it out.
Industrial. Contamination.
Toxic. Whenever are they going to do anything with this?
Yeah.
Promises.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so we're on the same page. Great. Did anybody work there or know anyone who worked there? What did you do?
Well, it's a cousin of ours that worked at the Zenith plant when I was part of that.
Great. Okay. So let me get started. So I'm going to talk, as Eric said, a lot about what we remember, what we forget. And I grew up spending a lot of time on Mackinac Island. So being here in Douglas is interesting to me because it's a tourist community, and there's a lot of constructed history. You know, you think about, what do you want to be known for? And on Mackinac Island, it's like they can invent a history that's romantic and that omits some of the, more ugly things. In that case, a lot of alcoholism, subjugation of native populations. So here, there's a whole other history, and I'm not qualified to speak on that other than the research that I've done at Blue Star Highway. So I want you to kind of keep in mind what you remember, what you forget, what you construct, and what cultural amnesia serves. As Eric said, I'm an artist, interdisciplinary artist, and a project I've been working on for about 10 years is called Fate of the Machinery. And I look at my family, they were industrial auctioneers. And so they sold off plants when they closed all over the country, from the 50s to the 2000s. And when I was coming to Grand Rapids, I proposed to do a project on Gulf and Western industries because I had noticed that Gulf and Western industries, they did a lot of auctions for them. They did, I can't see on my screen, but they did, Elgin Casket. They did a forge plant in Chicago, and then a number in Grand Rapids. And I started digging into that, and I realized that Gulf and Western industries started in Grand Rapids on Alpine at Ann. A guy named Charles Bludorn wanted to hedge against his coffee importing industries. So he saw that, if, in the 1950s, people needed replacement auto parts. And so he has this quote, getting a part of your car fixed is sort of like getting a toothache. When it hurts, you worry about it later. And so based on the desperation of people, through the purchases of pre-existing businesses, 10 years later, Gulf and Western controlled over 100 companies, had $1.3 billion in sales, and was 69th on the Fortune 500 street. That began in Grand Rapids. But people do not remember that. I have spoken to so many people throughout the course of the year, and 2 people remembered the name Gulf and Western. Some people said it's an oil company, and then nobody knew that it started in Grand Rapids. Just to give a little bit of context, this is a list of all the products they created. They had cigar operation, mining, matches, oxygen machines, paper, plywood, gravel, insurance, leasing, loans, sugar, molasses, paper, ventilators, wrenches, windows, and then in 1966 they took over Paramount Pictures. These are all the sites that they operated in West Michigan, and Chase Manufacturing at 200 Blue Star Highway was part of that. So there they made television knobs and refrigerator handles, and they primarily did plastic plating of plastic, metal plating of plastic, sorry. My dad always gets so mad at me because I'm like, what does die casting mean again? And he's like, how do you not know this? But I'm just like, okay, toxic. So at the same time, they were making films like The Godfather, Rosemary's Baby, Grease, Indiana Jones, Flashdance, Love Story, Willy Wonka, Star Trek. So this is the site in '64. And they bought it then, with a merger with Crampton. And so $6 million was paid for Crampton's family of companies, including Grand Rapids Brass, and Bay Casting. Crampton had a factory itself. They dealt with refrigeration techniques. And then the Blue Star Highway site, which was owned at the time, or started by the Scott brothers in 1952, and they did zinc die casting there. And that factory was called Chase Manufacturing. And when Gulf and Western bought it, they built a treatment facility for the effluent from their factory. And they thought they were doing, or they said, yeah, we're treating the effluent, but really what they were doing is they just ran it through a drainage ditch right behind the elementary school. And at the time, the children would call it Chemical Creek. A lot has been said about multinational conglomerates and multi-industry conglomerates, which is what Gulf and Western was. And a lot of people say, oh, well, they spread risk across multiple industries, so that we don't have to, we can weather the market. But in effect, they made a huge amount of money from the takeover itself. They were able to depreciate assets to not pay as many taxes. Sometimes Gulf and Western staged takeovers with no intention of actually going through with it, just to kick up their stock price. They would, for example, purchase half of a company, say they were taking over, the stock price would rise, and then they would say never mind and sell all that stock. In reality, factories taken over by Gulf and Western, employees reported decreased salaries, overly complicated leadership structures, and waves of layoffs. Everything that's been worth something here in the past has been skimmed off the company. This is all from the labor news from the 60s to the 80s. The Grand Rapids Press said that ultra executives of Gulf and Western had a Christmas party at the Blythefield Country Club. After hearing the tales of woe about losing money, it makes me wonder how we can afford it. They owned E.W. Bliss in Hastings, which made huge presses. And the union had several struggles with them, especially with safety issues. They also had a lot of fires and instances of dumping. Gulf and Western is seldom named in these. So it's always Bay Manufacturing, Michigan Plating and Stamping, FCM. They kept the names of these individual factories in these towns rather than putting Gulf and Western all over. And again, that's not a coincidence. They, at the same time in the 70s, are acquiring Miss Universe and the New York Knicks and Calvin Klein and Sega. This is true across the board, and workers at other multinational conglomerates have sort of, commented on this. One person said, we got the mushroom treatment. Right after the acquisition, they kept us in the dark, and then they covered us with manure, and then they cultivated us, and after that, they let us stew for a while, and then they canned us. So this is, was also the case at Blue Star Highway. There was a huge fire in 1970. It decimated, a third of the building, hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage. That's a quote from a firefighter. I counted heads 20 times, but these were happening all over. And this was at a time when companies, large companies especially, were who were saying, oh, the market isn't conducive to us manufacturing here. Well, they had the resources to move overseas and go to places where labor laws and environmental laws weren't as strict. And so you saw that more with large corporations, and the smaller companies would then have, close and have to pick up the pieces. But make no mistake, Chase Manufacturing was not a small company. You see job cuts. 1971, it's one of their earlier closing. Chase Manufacturing is closed by Gulf and Western, 1971. So 500 jobs lost between 3 factories. Grand Rapids Brass, Bay Casting were the other 2. And that Grand Rapids lost half of their entire waterworks budget as a result of this closing. And I think that's really important. Because a water department maintains this infrastructure that's supporting this factory, and then the company can just leave. So, so that year, 1971, Gulf and Western had just purchased a building in New York City in Columbus Circle, and they made Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, which is like kind of the irony of it being a very depressed town where a kid, if I read it, it's like he got hoodwinked into taking over this factory, right? Like, you know, like he gets sort of like put through all these tests of just like, are you gonna eat the blueberry? Are you gonna drink the chocolate from the fountain? Are you gonna, you know, float up to the top of the ceiling? You know, if you do that, then you are screwed and you might die. But if you make it through all these tests, then you can have the factory that is essentially totally obsolete because people can't afford food, let alone candy. So that's like my read on the film, which is part of the reason why I'm showing it. And these are some photographs of people commenting on the closing, and of course people are very optimistic. You know, we're gonna have an industrial park there, it's an opportunity, the site was kind of an eyesore anyways, and so it sits vacant for 5 years until Haworth begins operating there in 1976. And I really want to stress that the people that I've spoken with in Douglas, and this crowd may be different because, you know, the elders in the community are less out, and you all have a lot of knowledge, being, you know, maybe you're seasoned residents, maybe you're transplants, but there's a chance that you might remember this as Chase, but every single person I spoke with remembered it as Haworth. So they took over in 76, but so in 71, Gulf and Western also made The Godfather, or bought the rights to The Godfather, made it the next year. It grossed nearly $300 million. Some of my favorite stills from The Godfather. The next year, Gulf and Western paid no taxes to the federal government. Just kind of going through some of the films. 1978, they made Grease. It grossed $396 million. And there's an irony, mainly that Gulf and Western had been operating degreasing activities throughout the entire time they were there. But they were also under investigation by the SEC for mishandling financial statements, using company resources for personal gain, inflating stock prices, and they had also been tried in front of Congress, Special Committee on Conglomerates, that found that they were had a deal with Chase Manhattan that basically said all your business is going to go to us and not the local banks in those communities. So that was sort of one of the things. Charges were dismissed in 81, which was around the time that Gulf and Western sold the rest of their manufacturing facilities and bought amusement parks and television stations. This is a quote from Grand Rapids, the very first plant on Ann Street. Gulf and Western sold its firstborn to Wicks, which is another manufacturing company. Not Wicks Creek, but Wicks. Like any good child, we'll probably worry and wonder if Gulf and Western can make it on its own without us. Guess if I had to choose between Beverly Hills Cop or us, I'd probably make the same choice. Although I think we're funnier. So this is 1985. They cut everything loose and everything went to Wicks, including their their liabilities, everything. 1986, a year later, routine health department testing of Douglas's municipal wells turns up substance called TCE, trichloroethylene, in the city's drinking water source. And so Douglas capped its 2 wells and started relying on Saugatuck's wells. They were part of the Kalamazoo Lake Sewer and Water Authority, and so Saugatuck and Douglas were both putting water into the same system, but Douglas's water kind of went out of commission because it was found to have these volatile organic compounds. That same year, they made Top Gun, $57.3 million at the box office, while Douglas, it has, you know, lost its drinking water. And, you know, just to put it also into context, Jerry Bruckheimer, the producer, is now worth $1 billion. Tom Cruise made $2 million on that film. So ultimately, the pollution will get traced back to that factory site. It'll take about 4 years to figure that out, even though this is like the only factory site, the largest one. But I have, this is a collection of all the headlines from the Commercial Record and the Grand Rapids Press that gives you a sense of how long it took for the city to decide on how to continue getting water and supplement Saugatuck's water. So they did study after study after study, and people may think that, well, it's at least we had jobs for a little while, but this isn't, this wasn't just a loss to the tax base when they left. The state and the city have to pay for these studies, and then they have to raise the rates when there's, it's harder to provide drinking water, and the community then has to restrict their water use, even though we're less than a mile from Lake Michigan. Tons of water use restrictions all through the late 80s into the 90s. So that was the first thing that Douglas discovered 15 years after the company left. The second thing that they found was that there was PCB-laced soil behind the elementary school where the children were playing. In this coverage, Gulf and Western, not named. And again, one of the teachers remembers this from the middle school or from the elementary school, and she said, yeah, the Haworth plant was the culprit. The contamination is revealed. One parent says, we have a bag of toys. The kids play in the sand. I've taken them to that lot. I'm just so scared. Another one says, I have a 4-year-old daughter and I have to worry whether she'll get cancer. Another one says, it was a beautiful green stream. I had an awful time trying to keep my kids out of it. I made some inquiries. I was told it was just simply treated wastewater. So the state promised that the toxic waste will be removed by the time the school starts in the fall. And this is where they call it intermittent creek bed, but it was actually that drainage from the Chase plant, the Gulf and Western plant. And this is what they found, and this is where that site, roughly where that is now. It went right through the Amity cul-de-sac. And here's sort of a comparison between the back of the school where it was, and you'll see people walking through that site and the school in the background. So I asked people about Chemical Creek, and they remember that name. Some people do, and especially the elders that I've spoken with, and they pause. This has happened with a few people. They just sort of pause, and then they say, I wonder if my teacher who died when she was in her 40s got cancer, or my friend's younger brother died when he was in high school. And the thing is, we don't know what caused it, but that's not comforting, right? To say, well, we don't know, it's that's what, that level of sort of torture. It's you don't know if there's something wrong, you sort of think, but you can't always point the blame. And that's sort of the impact of leaving, it taking so long to determine the source of the problem as well. And that's because there's not resources to study these things and to hold these entities accountable. And so the community learns the cleanup isn't going to start before the end of summer because the Department of Natural Resources doesn't have the money, and then that doesn't start until the spring. So this is an editorial the parents wrote at the school. Children who attend Douglas Elementary spend 3 recesses a day, 180 days a year. Over a period of 7 years, anyone who's watched children at play knows the intimate contact that takes place between children and soil. Even children who stay clean breathe in dust. With uncontaminated soil, this is no cause for concern, but one soil sample shows 10 times the tolerable level of cadmium, heavy metal known to cause cancer. So this is the part that I think is kind of interesting. Walking on the grass at the park, which was right behind the school. It looks so healthy, looking above us at the blueness of the sky and watching the children playing on the equipment. It's tempting to think that things are pretty good the way they are and say to ourselves, well, carcinogens are everywhere in the environment and that's just part of modern life we have to get used to. Some of us told our children not to play there. While we don't have control over many dangers in our environment, and to endlessly worry about them would make pretty life dismal, we do have control over Kids Stuff Park. This is sort of like, let's clean this up, let's do better. And they do in January. Too cold. The digging machines sink into the softening ground and because it can't support the weight. And then, eventually it's cleaned up, and that year they made Beverly Hills Cop, Gulf and Western, grossing $300 million takes about a year to clean up this soil. And again, where's the accountability? So back to this drinking water issue, the state says that it's going to take us a really long time to find the culprit and get them to pay. We need to find new drinking water, like a new drinking water source. So they do like test after test of wells, and they find that they're contaminated or they don't have enough, enough water to, so they drill these test wells and they come up sort of dry. And then they determine that the groundwater contamination is 10 times worse than they originally thought. At one test well they drilled, the contamination was so bad that it broke the pumping equipment. So then in '89, we have Indiana Jones, $474 million worldwide at the box office. And then ultimately, 1989, Douglas decides to study more options other than just wells, because the wells aren't working out. And they determined that Lake Michigan is most cost effective for the water source. So they agree with the city of Saugatuck to work together to create a pipeline. And the interesting thing is, like, to fund this pipeline, there's not infrastructure money from the state, but there's like economic development money. So they can like build housing around it and then get money to serve that housing. Or make the case that it's going to be better for business. It just gives you a sense of the state's priorities. The thing is, though, is that lakefront homeowners are like, no. We're not going to have a pumping station. One person said, having a pumping station here is like raping the lakeshore. I find that ironic personally, given that we have a massive oil pipeline running under the Great Lakes, but that's a different talk. 1990, they finally realized that it's Wicks who had bought Gulf and Western. They don't say Gulf and Western, but they realize that it's that Chase site. Even though everybody kind of already knew it, they say, 4 years after they found the contamination, oh yeah, that factory actually is the problem. It's caused by this degreasing machine, leaking the byproducts of degreasing the plastic before they plated it. So that's what led to these volatile organic compounds. So the year they discover that it's that site, or prove that it's that site, Paramount made Ghost, $500,000 at the box office. $500 million. Then, there's this whole protracted battle of the water system and where they're going to get water. It ultimately doesn't end until 1994, which is 8 years after they first found the contamination. But Laketown Township just said, well, we'll join with you, but we don't want to get it from the lake. And I think that they had some interest for their property owners who didn't want to have a pumping station. They said, well, let's get our water from Holland. Let's build a pipeline there. It's going to be less, even though the study said, it's not the most cost-effective thing, they convinced Saugatuck and Douglas and then Saugatuck Township to all join together and get water from Holland. This would cost double the amount that Lake Michigan water would have cost. But then Laketown says, actually, we're not going to pay anything. We're not going to help build this thing. We're just going to pay for our hookups. So they kind of led them on, and then we're like, yeah, no, we're not going to, So Saugatuck township, city, and Douglas sort of scrapped the idea. They do a bunch more studies, all paid for by the city and the state, and then they just ultimately in 93 just reactivate the wells that were contaminated and treat them. Like they just reactivated it and put some treatment mechanisms in. $900,000 on an air stripping system. The tests say that the drinking water is safe today, and I'm sure that it is, but if the tests say so, you have to trust that, unless you live in Flint, or in a majority black community. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I think it's important to support the government's, water testing, but, keep a close eye on it. But, the interesting thing, or one interesting thing to me is, like, I spoke with a lot of people, and they don't really remember this contamination thing. One woman did, and she said, I think it was a dry cleaning byproduct. The TCE came out of the Chase plant. And so people associate it with dry cleaning, a small mom and pop business, but it's, actually from this, site that, and the DNR showed that. That same year, Haworth, who owns this Chase property now, finds these VOCs underneath the plant, flowing towards Wicks Creek. It's funny to me that the assumption that, when they found in 1990 that the plant was the culprit of these, drinking water problems, that they wouldn't assume that there was also contamination going into Wicks Creek and into the Kalamazoo Lake. But they didn't assume that. They just sort of treated it as a different instance. So then Haworth finds these VOCs underneath the former Chase site, and they install this treatment system, but they never put it into place because the state changed the law and said, well, if you didn't cause the contamination, you don't have to fix it. And there's a whole kind of convoluted set of laws where if you purchase the property and you know that it has issues, you have to treat it, and you have to do what's called due care. But in this case, Haworth didn't have to run this system. Ultimately, the state pays to treat that. So back to the 90s when Haworth finds this contamination under the plant, even though it should have been obvious that it was there. Forrest Gump, Paramount Pictures, grosses $648 million, second highest grossing film of all time. Again, just like more and more and more tests because the water from the wells isn't enough. Douglas and Saugatuck area are growing, and this is almost 10 years after the initial problem with the wells, and there's this issue, what are we going to do with water? How are we going to get more water? And a large part of it, and I'm not going to really go into it, is sort of this infighting that happens between the three communities, not really wanting to join together to create one system. Saugatuck Township actually had pretty good source of water. They didn't want to provide it to the water authority because the Saugatuck and Douglas wanted to charge them for sewage. It's like this whole battle, but I really do feel like that comes out of a scarcity that is sort of put upon communities when they are dealing with so many issues and don't have the proper funding. So back to this groundwater thing that Haworth discovers. So they discovered it in the 90s. Nothing really gets done until about 2006 when a developer wants to develop the golf course. And so they're like, well, we better take care of this, And it doesn't really matter who's working at the factory. Now that we want to use this land, we better mitigate these compounds in the groundwater. Again, test after test to just identify the scope of the problem, and then not having the money to do anything about it, and then having to retest because the problem has changed. In 2005, a few years after they sort of started to address the compounds in the groundwater, the city and Haworth determined that there are these forever chemicals, these PCBs, that were also in the soil behind the elementary school, like also in the ground at the plant. It's like, well, who knew? Like contamination doesn't just show up, but then over the next 15 years, it's like study after study after study, paid for the city and the state, Gulf and Western never spoken about. Finally, the site becomes abandoned in 2014 when Haworth closes. Again, like, oh, thank God, we're gonna be able to do something good with this site. But these are all people speaking to the news, city officials and planning officials about what could be done with this site. City doesn't want to wants to make sure it's not vacant for long. It could be repurposed into a whole hotel space, tree-lined medians, landscapes, pocket parks, rain gardens, better signage. Plan for the entire area, put together long-term plans that put together a development for the area, make it a cohesive area. Turn the blue feeling of the sprawling industrial into tree-lined, green tree-lined mixed-use centers. Gives the city a chance to change the roads image, right? That was in 2014. And this is not isolated. Brown Paper in Kalamazoo, also owned by Gulf and Western, has been vacant for 20 years, and kids just fuck around in the plant, and it's behind their middle school. So it's like this is not just Douglas. The developers coming and saying we're going to do something, and then deciding, well, maybe not. So this is what happened in Douglas in terms of this site. There was a number of conversations, and this is something you might also remember. This is me sort of mining the more local news coverage, but what it appears to be is that there was sort of conversation after conversation with this one developer named Dave Barker, and I don't know a lot about this person. I don't have any opinions about this person, but I can tell you what I've read. In 2018, he entered into a MOU with the city that said, you guys are gonna buy this from Haworth, you're gonna let me develop it, you're gonna clean up all the toxins, and I'm gonna pay for the demolition. And he didn't pay for the demolition. So here's his initial plan. So ultimately, the next year, the city buys it from Haworth for $100,000. It was valued at $520,000, but Haworth got it, gave it to them for cheaper so that they could get a tax write-off. But I want to give some context about the devaluation of this land. In 1976, Gulf and Western sold that plant to Haworth for $633,000 in 1976. Now the land is worth $520,000. And so, so the city buys it, they take on all of the liability, they end up paying for the demolition, all the while listing Barker as a potential developer on an EPA grant that they get. They pay $250,000 to demolish the plant. Then Eagle, they survey the site and they offset the city's cost to decommission this soil vapor extraction system that was put in place for a few years from 2006 to 2013. So basically the state puts in $300,000 and Douglas pays $250,000, which is more than the value of the land itself. The plant's north wall contains so much PCBs that the EPA would require them to haul them directly to a hazardous waste landfill. You might recognize this. I don't know if you've ever taken a walk on there. I think it's astounding to me that the marks from the original plant are still there. it's this enormous concrete slab. All you get to see is what's on the surface, and you can't dig it up because it's too toxic. It will cost too much money at this point to take out that foundation. Ultimately, the city got a grant from the EPA to do that. The total cost of mitigation and cleanup in order to make it able to develop, $639,000 was their last number. They want it to be complete by 2025. I don't know where that stands. The last time I looked into it, they were going to have sort of community input on how they want it to be developed. This is the EPA's letter to the city saying you got the grant to clean up the site. On behalf of the US EPA, I am pleased to congratulate you. So then, all the while these talks of this forest gate are happening near the site. And Dave Barker comes back, even though he didn't pay for the demolition, he comes back to the city in 2022 and says, we still want to build this forest gate. First at the golf course, the Miro golf course. But like that same month, the Planning Commission got an approval or got a submission from him, and at the same time learned that he had done previous work and was sued for not completing work permits. So then, the next year he was indicted for false pretenses. And then a few months later, the planning committee is still hearing his proposals to do this forest gate thing. And they're asking questions like, will the construction require disturbing previously contaminated soils? What are the risks that excavation poses? And it's like they studied this already. And they'll probably have to restudy it because it's changed. Have studies been conducted on the impact of adding new units for the Water and Sewer Authority? And it's like, this is resources for city council and planning committee to hear these requests while there's this knowledge that this guy got indicted for, false pretenses. So this is sort of one of the development plans for Blue Star Highway, and it's like we're not talking about contaminate. We're not talking about factories, but we are talking about, stormwater drainage and hooking into the existing water system and possible tax abatements. And I think we really need to consider why we have this continued desire for economic impact that will ignore community impacts and then go with the first person and then have it fall through. Last year, the city of Douglas hired a lawyer to figure out who else might be responsible for the contamination at the Blue Star site, because the EPA allows you to hold these potentially responsible parties accountable and go after them, even if they don't own the site anymore. And the lawyers did all this research and found out that Paramount Pictures, Paramount Global, is one of the potentially responsible parties. And in fact, they're responsible for up to 30 federal Superfund sites. Famous instance was New Jersey Zinc, where they paid out $30 million in Palmerton, Pennsylvania. To put that into perspective, the year that Gulf and Western last operated New Jersey Zinc, they grossed $180 million. So it's like recently the PR, 125 in annual sales the last year that they operated it. So the PR person for Viacom then was asked, because they bought Paramount and then turned back into Paramount Global. So when they were Viacom in 2015, somebody asked them, well, why aren't you reporting all these Superfund liabilities on your shareholder reports? And the spokesperson said, they don't have a material adverse effect on our financial condition. I'll close with, why don't we remember this? And I think it's just convenient for people in power to have us forget.